Good evening, everyone. I'm Karen Sander, the Director of Public Programs for the CUNY Graduate Center, and we are so delighted to have you join us here tonight, what promises to be an interesting and lively conversation. After just speaking with the two of them in the back for a little bit, it will definitely be lively, on a very, very timely topic. I would like to offer a welcome to those of you who are here in person, but also to our large online audience who are tuning in from places near and far. Thank you for joining us as well, and we hope someday you'll be able to come here to the CUNY Graduate Center here in New York City. Word about the Graduate Center: we are the main PhD granting body for the CUNY system, and we also offer many master's programs. Yeah, we've got a lot of smart people here in this building. Our graduates go on to do amazing work in so many different fields, and we are so pleased to present one of them tonight who has tackled a topic that needed looking at: how social media impacts women and girls. In her new book, Over the Influence: Why Social Media is Toxic for Women and Girls and How We Can Take It Back, Cara Alamo lays out for us the problems and also offers solutions. Cara will be in conversation with Madison Malone Kircher from the New York Times. Before I introduce both our speakers, let me give you the structure of the evening. Cara and Madison will dialogue for around 50 minutes, and then we will have around 10 to 15 minutes for questions from the in-person audience. We will pass around a mic, and I ask you that you please speak into it so that the people on Zoom can hear as well. And after the program, Cara will be signing books out front, so you can get a signed copy to give to all your friends and family members. Now, to introduce our guests. Cara Alamo is a communications professor at Fairleigh Dickinson University, where she created their program in social media. She writes frequently for CNN Opinion about the impact of social media and issues affecting women. Previously, she served in high-level communications positions for the UN and for the Obama administration. She earned her PhD in political science from the CUNY Graduate Center in 2015. Madison Malone Kircher is a reporter covering internet culture for the New York Times. Her work focuses on how we live online, from the latest TikTok trends to profilers of influence. She joined the Times in 2022. And before that, she hosted the ICYMI, a podcast about digital culture for Slate, and also spent 5 years writing about the internet for New York Magazine. Her work has appeared in The Cut, Vulture, Grub Street, Intelligencer, Curbed, Insider, Vogue, and Harper's Bazaar. So now it is my great pleasure to turn over the evening to Cara and Madison. Thank you.
Thank you. Hi, Cara.
Hello.
It's so nice to finally meet you in person and not on my phone.
Likewise.
So we're going to start with a tiny icebreaker. I often like to ask folks I interview, people I meet in bars or subway cars, what was your earliest social media memory?
My goodness. First of all, you made me very nervous with that intro.
There's no wrong answers.
My earliest social media memory is that Mark Zuckerberg started Facebook while I was in college. I remember my sister went to an Ivy League school and I did not. Eventually, I got an account at NYU and I asked to interview him. And I got a response back with a polite decline, but the fact that I got a response back.
I'm impressed.
That's right.
Okay, I like to ask people that because I think it really grounds an internet experience and sort of, I think, maybe the place where this book began percolating in your mind. It's an incredibly online and digital book. So let's start with your motivations. What was the inspiration for this great work?
Thank you. So originally I was motivated to try to figure out how I was going to handle the social media use of my own daughters. There's this saying that we write the books that we need to read. And after I finished it, I went for a walk with my CNN Opinion editor, and she and I basically had a laugh about how naive I had been to think that my biggest problem was going to be figuring out how to handle my own daughter's use of social media. because sort of the shocking thing that wasn't in the book proposal, the realization I came to after talking to women and girls across the country and doing my research for this book, is that my biggest problem is that my daughters are going to live in the world that social networks have wrought. And you spend way more time on TikTok than I do.
Way too much time. My brain is melting out of my ears.
But I guess, what I'd say is I think, and I'm curious if you agree with me, that like 8 or 10 years ago, of course, there was loads of misogyny on the internet, but it was more segregated to dark corners of the web. And now it is a common part of youth culture on TikTok to joke about violently abusing women. And that's unique compared to other forms of extremism in the sense that American teenagers are generally not on TikTok joking about beheading people. And I think we're now seeing that spill over offline because it's normalizing a new way of thinking about and treating women. And so I could tell you so many statistics, but everything from the women who say they've been, punched on the streets of New York City recently, the massive increases in domestic violence in this country since 2015. The CDC put out its Youth Risk Behavior Survey, which found a significant increase in the percentage of teen girls who said they'd been forced to have sex between 2011 and 2021. Again, same time that social apps are taking off. And so I think it's pretty terrifying.
Yeah, the New York City punching TikTok situation raises a really interesting point, right? Because to your notion that these pieces of content used to be sort of more disparate and in shadier corners of the internet, now algorithmically, young people and content creators online are being motivated by these algorithms to create more content like that. Mm-hmm. This feedback loop is actually creating more of this negative content you're describing. I'm curious how you see that.
Yeah, so I was actually in conversation with Roxane Gay a couple weeks ago, and I asked
Casual.
her... No, at an event. And
still casual.
I asked her about these women being punched on the streets of New York City. And so some of it is, right, that people know they'll get views if they post these things. But she also said if we're talking about 14 women, like, let's not use this as an excuse to increase our police presence in the city, right? So, I mean, there's more to the story for sure. But I do think that if you look at the overthrow of Roe versus Wade, I mean, all the things that women are up against in our society, I think things have gotten worse at the same time as social networks have taken off, and at the same time as we've seen this misogyny sort of promulgated on social networks. And one thing I know as a communication professor is that there's this huge literature that tells us that witnessing acts of violence in media is correlated with committing acts of violence. So I'm pretty worried.
Let's start with chapter 1 of the book, Girl Meets Instagram. It takes a look at how social media affects teenage girls. There's a very moving recollection of a young woman developing an eating disorder via social media that really struck me. We are at a point where it seems all but impossible to wall off young people from these platforms and subsequently that sorts of content, nor do I think we should, just to be super clear. Tell us a little bit about that chapter and what advice you offer parents for handling their daughter's use of these platforms.
Yeah. How much time do you have? So I tell this story in chapter 1 of Vivian, who is a woman who wrote to me after reading one of my CNN opinion columns and said, I got my eating disorder on Instagram as a teenager. So she was 15 years old when Instagram launched. She was an early adopter. She was into yoga, so she posted a picture of herself doing a handstand, and that ended up getting shared by a so-called Fitspo, fitness inspiration page, which sucked her down a rabbit hole of Fitspiration content. And now Vivian is a woman in her late 20s who, even after intensive treatment, still, of course, struggles with an eating disorder. And she works part-time as a physical trainer and says that her clients bring her their phones, pull out Instagram, show her pictures of women with the so-called Instagram body, which we know can usually only be achieved through surgery, and say, I want to look like that. But at the same time, I acknowledge that social networks are places where kids who are minorities in their physical communities find supportive communities and even lifelines. They're places where kids develop interests that turn into careers or get involved in important causes. And so a lot of it comes down to how kids use it. So a few quick tips for parents. I'm particularly concerned about the visually oriented platforms like Instagram that put so much emphasis on people's, and mostly women and girls' faces and bodies. So I think it's really important to talk to kids about why we shouldn't judge anyone, but especially ourselves, for their appearances. Another amazing woman I was in conversation with about my book is Kate Mann, who I think is one of the most important feminists alive, and her book Unshrinking was published in January. And she has this passage where she talks about taking out Instagram, showing it to her young daughter, pulling out pictures of people's bodies, people of all different sizes and races and levels of ability. And what she would say to her daughter is, "I'm so happy they're here in the world with us." And I thought that was just such a beautiful way of teaching a child, really anyone, not to judge people for their appearances. So that's a big one. The other thing is just talking to kids about sextortionists, right? And all of the other dangers they'll face online. So sextortionists are people who will establish an emotional relationship with a child or an adult, convince them to send one racy image, and then the next text that comes through is, Venmo me $25,000 in the next hour, or I'm texting this to your whole class, putting it all over social media. And I'd say if I have one piece of advice for parents, I interviewed an attorney who handles these kinds of cases, and she said, the most dangerous situation you can be in is if this happens to your daughter and she's afraid to come to you or come to a trusted adult. And so actually it's really good practice not to threaten to take away your kids' phones so that they don't worry about it happening in a moment when they've disregarded all the rules and now they need your help.
It does really seem like a lot of it boils down to, unfortunately, not the easy answer, constant vigilance, because the way this sort of content fitspo, if you will, is constantly renamed and repackaged. Are you familiar with legging legs?
I'm not. I thought you were going to say like Sephora kids, Botox babies. Is that very January?
I think legging legs was also January, but it was a TikTok trend that essentially boiled down to who has legs that look good in leggings, who has legs that should wear leggings. And for anybody who lived through the early aughts online, it felt incredibly pro-Anna, pro-anorexia content, sort of repackaged for a new generation. And I think that sort of speaks to your point that keeping watch constantly so you can talk to your kids about, oh no, we've seen this before. You're new here. We're not. Let me help you.
Exactly.
Don't get taken in by the legging legs. I think, correct me if I'm wrong, but in reading your book, I get the sense that you're still optimistic about social media and the internet as a place for women and young girls, despite all of the very data-backed darkness within the book you have written. How do you maintain that hope?
So social networks are definitely places where we can empower ourselves. I think there's no question. We know it's where we connect with important people in our fields and get involved in new projects. It's where we find jobs. It's where we sometimes even find authentic communities. And I'm very bothered by people who tell women if social networks are so toxic, don't use them. Because one, I just do not accept that we should give up a tool for empowering ourselves. But two, it wouldn't solve the problem, right? Because even if you and I mean, you'd be out of a job, and I guess I sort of would too, but even if you and I both decided to shutter our apps tonight, it wouldn't solve the problem that the misogyny that's all over social media is spilling over into offline violence. And so the only thing to do is to force tech companies to fix these problems.
I'd also like to keep my job just for what it's worth. You talk a bit about dating apps in this book, a fair bit actually, and you write that the deck is often stacked against women on these apps. You know, you wrote about a friend who, by all accounts, sounds like women we all know. You know, smart, savvy, sharp. Should have found the guy of her dreams ages ago because we all deserve them, and almost got catfished. And I feel like we all know somebody to whom this has happened. Why are these apps so toxic?
So there's this stereotype of single women. We can all picture it, right? She's vulnerable, she's needy, she's desperate to be in a relationship. Statistically, it's not true, by the way. So far more single men are looking for relationships than single women. But people prey on that. And now catfishing is this huge global enterprise. So it's not just often some guy in his basement. It's, these global crime syndicates who convince men in China to move to Cambodia for some amazing job in marketing. And then he gets there and he's basically held as a slave and forced to catfish women, sometimes under physical duress. But yes, one thing that struck me was how many of the brilliant women I interviewed told me they'd fallen for catfishers. So again, it's, someone establishing an emotional relationship, and then it's some version of the story that his webcam is broken, he can't turn it on, he needs to come fly to meet her immediately, and his wallet's been stolen. So, what's your credit card number? Let me just say, you're laughing. I interviewed one of the most senior women in the world of public diplomacy who explained to me how she'd been catfished. I was on Dr. Robin Stern's podcast, The Gaslight Effect, the famous psychotherapist. The name of her podcast is The Gaslight Effect. She told me all about how she'd been catfished. So women are falling for this. And, I heard over and over from women who I interviewed for this book that they'd stopped using dating apps, either one, because they were sick of being treated terribly, or two, because they thought that the people they were matching with weren't even real.
I love the era we live in, don't you? And just to be clear, you met your partner where?
I met him on Coffee Meets Bagel. He is in the audience, full disclosure. But I'll say that happened 10 years ago, before I think dating apps devolved to what they are today. And I also think stories like that are very dangerous because they suggest that it's easy, when in fact, I think dating apps are basically designed to keep people single. The marriage rate hit the lowest numbers since the federal government began tracking it in 1867, in 2020, and in 2021. And these are trends that were well underway before the pandemic.
Mm-hmm. Well, dating apps are businesses. I had a friend on Instagram stories this month who was crowdfunding to raise the $200 for a Bumble lifetime membership.
Well, why would Bumble want to match that friend with a partner? Because they'd stand to lose 2 users, potentially 2 paying users, right?
Exactly. I sent her $5.
Well, that was generous.
This is one of the sections of the book where you talk about how the online experience for women of color is often much worse than that of white women. How is discrimination baked into these apps for women of color?
So in the same way, it's baked into our society. So some of it is that dating apps allow people to filter based on race, and we know that Black women are the women who are least swiped. And one of my very close friends, whose story I tell in this book, is a Black woman who tried using dating apps and didn't have success. She ended up getting fed up and shuttering her accounts. But one of the things she talked about was the fact that, before dating apps became so prevalent, men used to ask her out. I don't use the term IRL in real life. I think that's totally, it's gotten very dangerous because it suggests that what's happening online is not real life. And I've mentioned that I think that what's happening online is very much affecting women's experiences offline. But, before, men used to ask her out in person when they met offline. And now that doesn't happen anymore either. So there's the dating apps. We know that women of color face the most abuse online. We know women of color have a hard time working as influencers. So one woman I interviewed, a Black woman, her name is Kelly Boyer, and she's a running influencer. And she's applied to work with the same brand 3 times that works with white influencers with very similar follower counts and content as hers, and they keep turning her down. And she thinks part of it is she doesn't have the stereotypical body that people picture when they picture a runner. So pretty much everything that I discuss in this book is just orders of magnitude worse for women of color.
You talk a bit about online disinhibition in the book, which is the idea that people online hiding behind keyboards tend to be a whole lot worse and rough on people than you might be in conversation with a real person. I'd like to talk a little bit about the flip side, though. Are there ways that the anonymity of social media, and you touched on this a little bit earlier, allows for young women and girls to discover communities and to learn things and to ask questions they otherwise might not be able to? Yeah. I do say, as someone who spent much of her teenage years Googling lesbians, ?
So yes, I mean, the
The
answer.
answer, by the way.
So the answer is, of course, yes. But I do think that anonymity has gotten dangerous in certain places of the internet. So great for kids exploring their identities to not have to use their real names. But then this is also a way that, you've got End Wokeness and other political accounts, spreading misinformation that is traveling widely right now in the US. I think that I talk about this New Yorker cartoon in the very early days of the internet. I don't know if you remember it, but it was a picture of a dog sitting at a computer, and the caption was, on the internet, no one knows you're a dog. And so the idea was people wouldn't be able to see your race or your gender or these other markers of discrimination when you could hide behind your computer screen. And sometimes that works really well, right? It allows people to explore identities, or it allows activists to share information more safely. But I guess what we've also seen is, quite the opposite. And so the online disinhibition effect is this idea that people will do things online that they would never have the guts to do to your face. And part of it is because people consider the online world to be a fantasy realm or a game, and they forget that there's real people with feelings on the other side of the screen. And then also just, when like-minded people get together, their views become more extreme, whether it happens online or offline. So, you get a bunch of men with deep grievances towards women together, and then they egg one another on, and that breeds confidence. And then you see this spill over into, mass shooting sprees, as we saw in Sydney just a few days ago.
So the topic of your book is an ever-evolving one. I imagine the minute you sent that final copy out, things started happening that you thought, dang, that would have made a great chapter.
Yes, how did you know?
Or a terrible chapter, to be very clear, but an interesting one. So let's talk about maybe a more recent iteration of how technology is being harnessed to exploit women and girls, the deepfake nude, which I'll let you explain what that is for folks who may not be familiar.
Sure. So deepfakes are fake images generated by artificial intelligence. And the tools for creating them are now widely available on the internet, either for free or very cheaply. And surprise, surprise, the vast majority of deepfakes that are being created are pornographic. And this is something I feel very strongly about, because one of the things I did write about in my book is what happens to women and girls when their intimate images end up online. And so when a woman's intimate images end up online, it puts her at greater risk of depression, it puts her at greater risk of suicide, it puts her at greater risk of sexual assault, it makes it harder for her to date, it makes it harder for her to get a job. It is life-destroying. And I live in New Jersey, where last fall, some boys in the town of Westfield, New Jersey, created new deepfakes of their female classmates. And the thing that I just couldn't get past in the Wall Street Journal's reporting of the issue was that parents in the town of Westfield were divided about whether this was a big deal. And subsequently, we've seen this happening to 12-year-olds, to children at a middle school in Beverly Hills just a few weeks ago. And so I very much feel like I am on a mission, and I promise not to be too professorial, but one thing I'll say as a communication professor is that the way we name an issue, the way we talk about an issue is so important. It prescribes the solutions. It determines so much about how people handle it. And I am on a one-woman mission right now to define new deepfakes as a grotesque form of violence against women and girls. I think it's important for, first of all, parents and adults to understand this. I think kids should be taught in schools, and obviously by their parents, what the possible repercussions are, to take the excuse off the table for a kid to later say, oh, but I was just having fun. I didn't think it would be a big deal. I also think, obviously Congress has failed epically to regulate social networks in appropriate ways, but we are at this critical moment today where it is not too late, actually, for legislation to address this. So part of it is the Defiance Act, which is a bill before Congress right now, would allow victims to sue perpetrators. And obviously that's highly imperfect because it's often very difficult to identify perpetrators, but I do think it would act as a really powerful deterrent. And then we know that President Biden has secured voluntary commitments from big tech companies to watermark AI, for what that's worth. But again, here's where we need legislation to require that all content created by AI be watermarked, and also, just as critically, to prohibit the removal of those watermarks, which is super easy to do.
On a smaller or more local level, are there things you'd like to see implemented at schools or libraries or community centers? Because, like you said, pursuing a legislative solution for this internet crimes, often it's hard to find a perpetrator or any one perpetrator. It just, you get lost in the mess, and the person who's suffering, a 12-year-old girl, sort of is left hanging out to dry. So I'm curious if there are smaller ways you could see us moving forward with this issue.
Definitely. So in our country has just failed epically to educate kids about social media generally, and obviously this emerging topic as well. I have young children, and if they were growing up in Finland right now, they would be learning how to identify manipulated images and how content is designed to affect their emotions at the same time as they were learning how to read and write. Here in the United States, I teach at Fairleigh Dickinson University. I created a program in social media there. No student who has ever taken one of my social media classes as an undergraduate has ever received an education in social media and how to protect themselves online before walking in the door of my classroom. And that is just, it's so negligent. And so, yes, I want to see kids educated in schools. And I think we have to recognize that plenty of teachers would talk about these things, except that they're afraid of coming under fire from parents and from their communities. And so we need curricula that are mandated by states. Every child should get these curricula. Another thing that's really sad is that kids in poor communities are far less likely to learn these things than kids in more affluent areas. And of course, kids in poorer areas spend more time on social media and are much more vulnerable. So we need curricula in schools. We need sessions for parents and adults generally in libraries and community centers. But just to go back to big solutions for a second, I do have a brilliant idea for how to handle these kinds of investigations. And it's that, obviously we need a massive increase in resources for the FBI to investigate these kinds of crimes. And obviously there needs to be a mandate for the FBI to take these kinds of violations seriously. And I have a very easy way to fund it, which is with a tax on social networks.
You touched on this a bit. So much of our online experience these days is fake or enhanced. AI-generated nudes, filters that make your face look better, or the ones that really freak me out are the filters that change the entire shape of your body, and you can move and wiggle and dance, and you still look thinner and taller and brighter. Freaks me out a lot. And it's getting really hard to parse what is real. I'm curious if you think we're going to get to a point where we just have to assume nothing is. Is that the way to stay on these platforms?
So first of all, I'd say, it makes everything we're talking about tonight so much scarier to think about AI getting involved, because I don't know if you saw the announcement that Dove made last week
About the AI models?
Yeah, so Dove basically became, they say they're the first beauty brand to pledge not to use models created by AI, but they released examples of what happens when you ask AI to create a picture of a gorgeous woman. And if you think the 1980s were bad, these are not women who these are not images of people who I think could exist in real life. And so the possibility here is we already know that everyone shares, filtered images of themselves and their lives on social media, and that's hard for everyone, but in particular teens. We know the Instagram body isn't real, and now there's the chance for things to get so much worse. So yeah, I guess the answer here, right, is for places to identify when they're using AI and when they're not. But I was just reading the other day about even Instagram creating a bot so that influencers could talk to their followers, and none of this would be created by the influencer, right? It would just be adopting their tone. And so it does beg the question, I guess, of why people, which I think the Times asked at the end of their story, why do you want to talk to a robot, right? And I guess, just another thing I tackle in my book is the friendship famine in the United States, right? And I think that that's part of the answer here. And so it is now more common for people to be disconnected from other people than to have strong friendships. And we know that, to keep us healthy, we don't need 20,000 followers on Instagram. We need 2 people we can call at the end of a really bad day. And friendships are more important for our health than diet and exercise. And so, this trend started with the arrival of television when people started watching sitcoms instead of going out bowling. But it's gotten, it's really accelerated with the advent of social media. And so it just almost feels like everything is going to become even more soulless, right? Instead of interacting with humans, we're going to go online and talk to bots. I mean, what is that going to do for humanity?
I mean, I'm glad we've finally gotten to the answer of why I'm such a terrible bowler.
There you go, because you're on TikTok.
There it is. I think perhaps in the era where you were emailing Mark Zuckerberg asking for an interview, so sorry about that, there was this idea that social media and professional careers were not going to mix, that you were going to keep your online presence separate and your work life separate, and that, as we all know, that Venn diagram is now a circle. And you write in your book about the fact that when women use social media to try to bolster their professional profiles, they often end up with fewer followers, fewer shares, reposts, forms of engagement. There was a 2021 study you referenced that stuck with me that found that male physicians were more likely to receive scholarships and speaking engagements when they posted on social media. Spoiler, it doesn't happen if women do it. You have a bunch of other examples that are now seared into my brain, and I'm thinking about every other post I've made about my job. Why is this happening? And more importantly, what can we do about it?
So I think this comes down to old-fashioned bias that when people are asked to picture an expert, they picture a man. If you ask someone to picture a doctor in their head, they're going to picture a white man, not a Black woman, right? And so when people go online looking for medical expertise, which is generally a terrible idea, like it's, TikTok is not where anyone should be getting their medical information. But, when people go on X looking, for experts, they follow men. And so the good news here is here's a place where we could all radically change this. So many of the women I talk to at my book events, walk out of my events telling me, "You've terrified me. I'm worried for myself. I'm worried for my daughters." And I say, "Great, because you should be." But also, I do want to have a message of hope here. And it is the case that if we all radically changed, so my message is if we radically rechange who we follow, what we share, and what we do when we witness sexism and misogyny online, we could fix a lot of these things. And so I've actually created a list of feminists to follow on my website, which is just myname.com. Feel free to pick whoever you want, but the point is, go home and follow 10 more women experts today, right? And then when you see their posts, amplify them. And if we all did that, we could fix this problem in a week. And of course, if people started seeing women experts more, they would come to see women as experts, right? And so that in and of itself is the solution.
We're going to pivot a little to the topic of influencers, who are a large part of this book also. I think culturally we have an image of an influencer, somebody who posts a couple of videos and makes a lot of money doing it. And those people exist. I interview them all the time. I am awed by them, and it's a fascinating economy. But it's not an entirely accurate picture. In your book, you write that often influencers are women who are being exploited by the very work we think they're being paid to do, and often are not. Why is this happening?
So the vast majority of influencers online are women, and the these women are on average earning far below the federal poverty level. And I think these are women who 20 years ago would have been freelance writers for the New York Times and for women's magazines. We all know, I certainly know as a mom of young kids, that it is incredibly difficult to earn a living or do something professionally and balance that with your childcare responsibilities. We live in a society where moms, I mean parents, but mostly moms, are expected to pick up our kids at 3:30 in the afternoon and to be at our desks at 3:30 in the afternoon. And so a lot of women are looking for flexible jobs that they can do while their kids are in school or at daycare. And it used to be the case that you could earn more money as a freelance writer, but now the advertising revenue that used to support newspapers and magazines largely instead goes to places like Facebook and Google. So now you find these women trying to be influencers. And they're hugely often exploited by brands. So the pay gap between women and men influencers is significantly greater than the overall pay gap in the United States. But I interviewed these women, and this job is not glamorous. They talked about how they felt pressured to constantly project perfect lives so that they could be paid for posts on behalf of brands. And as I write in the book, no one wants to buy products so that they can look like harried women with misbehaved kids and messy homes, right? So that's not what you can post. And so they're constantly trying to be perfect. The expectation of women influencers in particular is that they will overshare very intimate information about their lives. Plenty of these women do not want to be sharing pictures of their bedrooms and updates on their romantic relationships and pictures of their kids, but it's what is expected of women. Followers get into parasocial relationships, right? They expect these endless responses because, if you watch Pretty Woman, you don't think that you're friends with Julia Roberts.
Oh no, we're friends.
That's another conversation.
Mistake, huge.
But people follow influencers and they're kind of supposed to be like us. So people think they're their friends. They expect responses to their messages. Enter the bots, I guess. Here's another answer. So it's very difficult to be an influencer. And I would just, say I've been surprised that there have been tons of therapists in my audiences at so many of my book events, and they keep saying their clients need to read this chapter, which I call Digital Housewives, because, their clients keep coming to them saying, why doesn't my life look like, the lives of these other women, influencers and non-influencers online? And of course, on the other side of all of this, these influencers are up against these very same challenges. So it's really sad.
Let's talk a little bit more about motherhood. You've got 2 chapters on mothers in the book, specifically on how misinformation is very much targeted at mothers online. I'm thinking about, you open one of the chapters with a story about a woman who really wanted to have a home birth, to give birth at home, and did not, and ultimately had a healthy baby who was born in a hospital and felt like that was a failure because of what she had been reading and watching and seeing online. Can you talk a little bit more about why that's so pervasive?
Yeah, so I think that, I have one chapter called Misinformation for Mommies, which is actually the sample chapter that sold my book to my publisher. And I think we talk about all different kinds of fake news related to elections and other subjects, but this is something that we rarely tackle. And so part of it is that mothers are vulnerable, and people know that, right? So when you have a baby, you're home recovering physically, you're trying to keep a baby away from germs, which can be deadly in the first few weeks of life, and you have all these questions about how to keep this tiny human alive. Or you're pregnant and you have all of these questions about what you can eat and what you can't eat. It's very complicated and confusing. And so people turn to social media. And on social media, there's huge trends telling women that they need to have natural childbirth, which involves giving birth at home, which is, much, much more likely to result in the death of a baby than giving birth in a hospital, to forego pain medication, which is generally safe and effective. And I note that, there's no corresponding movement telling men to forego anesthesia when they have horrifically painful medical procedures. And, women come to believe that this is the norm, right? That this is what they should be doing. And so, some of these things are being posted by women who are just trying to get validation. So one element in this is that if you're a stay-at-home mom, there are very few ways to get affirmation in our society. So you post a video about how you got your newborn to sleep through the night. But the problem is, one thing I know from having 2 children is that no 2 children are alike. And so you have other moms watching this content saying, why can't I get my kid to sleep through the night? It's so simple, and this woman can do it and I can't. When in reality, what they're seeing is what worked for one kid in the context of probably very different life circumstances. Then you've got people with no credentials, right, sharing recipes for homemade infant formula during the recent shortage. We know that unfortunately there's no safe way to make infant formula at home. It requires a complex mix of nutrients that can't be purchased at the grocery store. And then the other category is, of course, the people who are actively preying on mothers, because everyone knows that a mother will do anything to help her child. So a kid is sick, and people swoop in and say, I've got the essential oils to solve this problem at vast cost. And moms fall for it.
Yeah, it's hard out there. And I think especially when you factor in we live in a country with alarming maternal mortality rates for women of color who, to our chat earlier, this idea that the internet is a place where you can go to seek out advice you might not be getting in your day-to-day life, or you may not be able to find a medical professional who can speak to your needs so personally, and you turn to the internet, and if it feeds you this, well then what's left?
That's exactly right. And one of the things I acknowledge is that doctors need to listen to women, right? So part of it is that women are going online and seeing these stories of doctors not listening to women when they're giving birth. And that happened to me in my first delivery as well. And so therefore they're concluding they shouldn't use a doctor. And so, part of the solution, of course, is for doctors to listen to women and all members of the medical community, right? Which would help solve this problem. But the other part of it, of course, is not getting your medical information on social networks.
I want to take things IRL because we talk
Can't
a lot.
use that term.
I can in this room right now. Right. So the idea that the internet and the offline world are 2 separate spaces is one that's been debunked many, many, many times over at this point. And your book argues that social media has made the offline world ultimately a less safe place for women. Why is that?
So I think it's everything we talked about. It's this sense that, misogyny is all over social networks right now. There was a study done at University College London that was published just a few weeks ago. They asked boys in the UK, teenage boys, what topics they search most frequently on TikTok, set up accounts on TikTok and searched those terms. Within 5 days, the amount of misogyny promoted on TikTok's For You page quadrupled. And so part of it is that misogyny is being actively promoted because, like anything else, social networks show people what will get clicks and likes and keep people online, what they think these people want. And I think that people are watching this content and it's normalizing abuse towards women. It's normalizing thinking about women in very dehumanizing ways. And so whether it's, the increase in teen girls being raped or whether it's the increase in domestic violence, I just see signs of this everywhere in our society right now. And I think, the answer, of course, is to demand that social networks stop hosting this content.
Mm-hmm. What are some of the effects of the hate and abuse that women face online for our emotions, our personal lives, our well-being, our physical safety?
Yeah. A lot of women are fleeing social networks because of this hate. There's this term, the flounce. Were you familiar with this term?
I was not.
Okay, well, check out Urban Dictionary. But, it's this term that comes from the Victorian era. And so if you were to say someone flounced, it's this idea of a woman gathering up her petticoats and storming out of the room. And that's how women are referred to when they flee social networks because they're receiving rape and death threats. So part of it is that they're losing a tool where they could be empowering themselves. But I think it's absolutely terrifying for women to be up against this kind of abuse online. I cite statistics in my book that women in the fields most likely to lead to political office, so business, law, those kinds of fields, are actually less likely to say that they would consider running for office now than they were 20 years ago. I interviewed, again, Roxane Gay. She said, you'd have to be crazy to be a woman, running for office, given what you're going to be up against on social media. And so it's not just the effects of how these women feel, which I'm sure this is very traumatizing, but it's the effects for our whole society of running women out of public spaces. The only thing I can compare it to is my work in Saudi Arabia, a decade ago in the Obama administration, where, I would stay at the Ritz-Carlton and be told, you can't use the swimming pool and you can't sit in that part of the lobby. And that's what's happening now, right? Women are fleeing these spaces because they've become just too terrifying, whether it's political office or whether it's TikTok.
We're gonna move to an upper. We're gonna try to find an upper here.
Good luck.
Here we go. You've said that you don't think the answer is deleting all the apps. Although I'm curious, is there an app you've ever left or taken a break from or said this one's not for me?
So I will not use TikTok. I will watch TikToks and follow trends, but I will not use TikTok as an account as myself. And part of it is, I worked in the Obama administration. The Chinese government stole my fingerprints. And so I think that the national security threats of TikTok are very, very real.
So when you say you just watch TikTok, you don't have an account?
I don't have an account in my name.
Okay.
But I will watch TikToks and follow the trends very closely.
I'm just curious if you're getting a totally randomized algorithm. That must be quite the feed.
Yeah, although I think they know, right?
They know who you are. Well, they have your fingerprints.
Well, they've got my fingerprints, right? I'm watching TikToks about microfeminism and being a girl's girl, so I think they've got my number.
Yeah, probably. So aside from not having a TikTok account, it sounds like you are forging ahead on all of these social media platforms and that the answer is not for us to delete them. Please give us your best pitch for why we should not delete them, because it's hard out there.
I wrote an op-ed about my book for the Los Angeles Times, and the editor sent it back and said, you have to answer this question, right? If you say social networks are so toxic for women and girls, like why should we be using them at all? And I guess the answer is that they don't have to be the way they are now, right? So they could be places where when people issue rape threats, Meta removes the content and perhaps removes the user. They could be places where we promote our work, where we get involved in causes, where we find other women and advocate for issues that affect our lives, where we post about issues, where we tag lawmakers and corporations and demand that they do things. Have you been following microfeminism on TikTok?
A little.
I have to say, I absolutely love this trend. And I, as someone who thinks about issues affecting women all the time, have totally learned from it.
Why don't you describe microfeminism for...
So the idea of microfeminism is, and there's all these TikToks suggesting just small acts that you do to upend the normal gender system. So calling on a woman first, taking up more physical space in a place, doing all of these things to upend traditional gender norms. And just yesterday, this woman who I badly want to work with at a speakers bureau wrote me back, and she said in her email, I'm reading your book, and I say in my book that my husband is the cook in our family. Mm-hmm. And she said, my husband is the cook in our family as well. And so I wrote her back just because this has been top of mind. And I said, phenomenal. We should swap recipes for our husbands to make us. And this will be a perfect act of microfeminism, right? Which it is. Can't you see the TikTok? And so, right, here is like something I'm not just talking about this act, right? But like thinking about all of these intentional acts, all of these TikToks have women talking about them now, hopefully people of all genders. And so it can be a place where we talk about microfeminism and not misogyny.
Was the LA Times editor, was that answer sufficient?
Well, she ran the op-ed on publication date, so I guess it
Great.
worked.
Worked for me too. We're going to open up to the audience for questions now. If anyone has any for Kara. I think there's a microphone going around. Yeah.
So you mentioned misogyny and how it's harmful for women. And I think when we think about misogyny, it's often, men harming women. And we think of like Andrew Tate, I think that's so he's like misogynistic and whatnot, or toxic. But you also mentioned that most influencers are women, and there can be instances where they are perpetuating like false information, like the mothers who like perpetuate, I don't know, or Gwyneth Paltrow with Goop thing. So do you think, but I feel like most of the time when we think of, things that are harmful for women, we think, oh, it's men attacking women, but should we also be thinking more about like attacking Gwyneth Paltrow or Goop or whatever, or like those moms that like promote the pseudoscience you mentioned?
So I generally take the view, I have 2 chapters in this book where I look at how the world judges women. And as you might imagine, the answer is unkindly. And I talk about how social networks have become places for people to judge women more than ever before. So one story that really got me to sit down and start this book was April 2021. I was feeding my newborn baby, and because I write for CNN on breaking news, anytime something happens related to social media or issues affecting women, everyone in my circle texts me. And so my husband sends me this text, and the story is that Jill Biden has walked onto an airplane. And according to Glamour magazine's website, Twitter broke. And the reason is she was wearing a pair of stockings, and people couldn't decide whether or not they were fishnet stockings, whether she was a prostitute, whether she was a witch, whether she was representing the country well, and something in me just broke. And so I think that it is fair to say, and I make a huge case for this in these 2 chapters, that the world has long judged women uncharitably, going back to Eve, but social networks have created a place where now everyone can have an opinion on the First Lady's stockings, right, as she does her unpaid work representing the country. So I'm kind of not on a mission here to judge women uncharitably. I think the answer is not to seek out the medical advice on social media. It's to call your pediatrician or call your doctor when you have a question, rather than sort of like publicly shaming women or calling out women who I think have a hard enough time on social networks to begin with. And just the other thing I'd say is, there's all of these, there's a lot of content about women not treating other women fairly, mean girls, that kind of content. And the data tells us that women are not more aggressive than men. And so I think a lot of this comes down to stereotypes we have and the particular lenses through which we judge women. So yes, women post problematic content on social networks, and my answer isn't to call them out, it's to just kind of ignore it, which I think is a great solution for problematic content generally.
Anything Gwyneth is saying about sunscreen, just ignore. Anybody else have a question? And if you are asking a question, please speak into the microphone so the folks on Zoom can hear you as well.
Thank you. Yes, so last night I'm not on TikTok either, but I saw this video about some person who owned like a parchment paper company attacking a woman simply because her dad was cooking her a meal. And what I found so telling was that what made this person so unhinged, and this was a man, by the way, what made him so unhinged to attack this woman that he does not even know, and telling her, "Oh, you're living an easy life because you're on TikTok." And as I come in and I hear this conversation, I'm thinking, what has gone on in our society, especially with us men, where we feel emboldened, and I feel like I've seen this over the past few years, where you might have a man who doesn't attack someone, but they'll have these microaggressions online, and they feel so emboldened in going out of their way and hurting other people, even hurting other guys that are supposed to be like brothers, etc. But what have you seen in your observations? Do you think there's a reason for that? And as somebody who's not like that, what can we do as men to protect our women, especially those that are our sisters and grandmothers and mothers, etc., in our lives?
I appreciate the question. So I guess the motivation, part of it is clicks, right? That people will watch this, and part of it is the culture. One of the things I talk about in my book is how very difficult it is to ask men to change. And so I talk about how a lot of what women are promoted in ads and the way like feminism has been promoted on social media is through like, videos from Dove telling us, act confident, feel beautiful, buy the right shampoo, you'll solve all your problems, right? And so as women, we're used to being told constantly how we can improve ourselves. And the story I opened my last chapter with is of Gillette's video. Do you guys remember the video they posted online a couple years ago? It's called The Best a Man Can Be. And the video basically provokes some strong emotions, both online and in the room. And it basically called on men not to assault people and not to allow other people to be assaulted in their presence. And so this wasn't a video that called on men to like share opportunities with women or anything like that. I interviewed the executive producer. He pulled up videos for me of men hitting their Gillette shaving creams with aluminum bats, pledging to never buy a Gillette product ever again until everyone involved with this ad had been fired from top to bottom, et cetera, et cetera. It became the most disliked ad of all time on YouTube. And so that's what happens when you ask men to change. And he told me no major brand has he's never seen another ad from a brand asking men to change ever since, right? Even though this is the way brands talk to women every day. So it is very difficult to make that ask, to have that conversation. And I do think that part of it is the messenger, right? So someone asked me at my Atlanta book event, like, what about like the men and boys? And I guess just I don't think I'm the best messenger, right? To go in and talk about masculinity. But there are people who are, and I would love for them to step up. I remember writing for CNN in the period in between Joe Biden serving as vice president and being elected as president. He was going around to college campuses talking about rape culture. And here's a man who boys could look up to, right? And I remember calling on Mark Zuckerberg and other men, athletes, other men to step up. And so I do think it's a matter of having the right messengers. And, these men probably aren't the ones reading my book.
Got another one in the front.
Hi, thank you both so much. So a lot of the social platforms do, as you guys know, have policies prohibiting a lot of content that fits the description of what you're describing. And they don't enforce them well at all. At all. And then obviously enforcing them, to be fair, is really hard. And it doesn't seem to me that there's a great way to do it. I was curious if you had any specific, in the course of your research, come across any policies that you in particular think sound promising or different ways of going about it, or if there's other approaches besides content moderation that you're interested in, or what changes you in general would like to see platforms make aside from just actually enforcing their policies.
So I'd love for them to enforce their policies, but it's a dumb business decision not to. And so there was research, it was fascinating, after Twitter originally removed Donald Trump, millions more people started using the platform fairly immediately. And so, you don't have to be a data scientist to see that, people flee social networks when they don't feel safe on them. And if you look at the apps that have the reputations for tolerating more abuse, I'm thinking like Reddit and X, they have far more men on them than women, whereas apps like Instagram have far more women on them. And so it's just a good business decision to not have women fleeing your platform, right? We're a pretty big constituency. And so I think part of it is just booting off a few high-profile people, and I think people do get the message and get in line. There's another study that was done of when League of Legends booted off abusive players. They ended up getting way more users, and when some of those users returned, their behavior was much better. And so it's actually quite easy to send these signals. It's just that people like Elon Musk don't want to.
So I use TikTok a lot.
Meet Madison. Same. You can be besties.
And I know that one big thing that's been happening is the mom influencers have been seeing, who show their children on their profiles, have been seeing a lot of negative comments about their children or men sexualizing their 2-year-old. So my question is, have you seen that, and what's your opinion on that? How do you think it's best to change that trend happening right now?
Yeah, and the Times had the huge story about parents running accounts that are followed by pedophiles. My opinion on this is that it's not a great idea to post pictures of your kids publicly. I do it on closed platforms, right, where I control who my friends are. And we could have a long conversation about that, but in general, I've come to the conclusion that I think it's good for my kids to have people all over the world who love them and feel invested in their lives. And so I do it on a very selective basis. I don't think it's a great idea for parents to post pictures of their kids publicly. I think that's the solution.
I mean, the only data point I need is that Mark Zuckerberg puts a little emoji over his kid's
Kids'
face when he
faces.
posts them online.
Enough said. Yeah.
I think I'm about to ask you if you can answer this question, you need to go into a new line of work. But what is so Mark Zuckerberg appeared in front of Congress in January around this, what social media companies need to do to protect kids. And there's kind of this passing the buck back and forth of the social media companies we'll do something as soon as the government tells us what to do. But on the other side, you have legislators who don't really understand or seem to understand really how these things actually work. If you're under 13, you need to get permission. It's yeah, that's sure. Okay, click. My kid is 3. She can do things on YouTube that I can't do. So there's always a way to move around that. What do we need? What is the information that legislators really need to understand? What does the legislation look like that would actually be effective? I mean, part of it is social media companies should be held accountable if a 12-year-old boy or 18-year-old man threatens to rape a 12-year-old girl. What does that legislation maybe look like? But maybe even more that, what's the nitty-gritty that legislators need to understand?
How much time do you have? Can I say who you are, or do you want to say who you are?
Sure. You can say who I am.
Charlotte Gartenberg, who's a podcaster for the Wall Street Journal. And
I have my PhD from here, by the way.
Oh, that's right. That's the most important thing. So I covered that testimony for CNN, and I almost don't know where to start because Mark Zuckerberg sat there and he looked lawmakers in the eye and he said, I'm not sure data really supports this idea that social media is so bad for kids. And let me tell you why he can say that. It's because, in fact, the data is mixed. And my theory on this is that so much comes down to how kids use social networks, right? Some use it in really healthy ways, some use it in really unhealthy ways, gender, et cetera. So it is the case that the data is mixed. And, I watched this testimony do you watch this testimony?
I have watched all the
For
testimonies.
hours and hours for CNN. And I'm really appalled that these are my lawmakers because, first of all, I almost don't know where to begin. They ask, tech executives, do you support this bill? Yes or no? Who cares whether they support it, right? If it's the right bill, they should pass it. And it's all such showmanship. I will say, I think the cringy moments have decreased over the years. I think
I beg to differ, but
I think no more do lawmakers ask Mark Zuckerberg how he makes his money, right?
sell ads, Senator.
But the whole system is designed for television, right, and not really to pass legislation. I do have an unpopular opinion here, which is that I don't think young kids should be on social networks. And when we think about legislation, and part of the problem is that it is really hard as a parent. All the parents I interviewed for this book told me they didn't want their kids on social networks, but the problem was that everyone else's kids were on social networks, and they didn't want their kids to be excluded from important communities and friendships and things like that, or to be outcasts. And so I know this is an unpopular opinion. I think Ron DeSantis is right on this one thing. Which is not allowing kids on social networks until they're a bit older. There's really great research out of the UK that shows that when kids use social media during the time they're going through puberty, it is associated with lower life satisfaction a year later. And so there's these really important windows, which are younger for girls than for boys, when it's a really terrible idea. And I, believe it or not, would support legislation that keeps kids under 15 off social networks. So Madison's colleague Sapna once asked me at what age I was going to allow my kids to use social networks. And I said 16, which is the equivalent of telling her age 40. She actually threatened to put my daughter's 16th birthday on her calendar and follow up with me because it's that difficult.
She probably did, just to be really clear.
probably
You should
will.
expect that birthday call, yes.
And because it's so difficult as an individual parent, right? So I talk about the importance of talking to the parents of your kids' friends, collectively agreeing to keep them off, but the better thing for parents and for kids, believe it or not, probably wouldn't survive a constitutional challenge. But the best thing lawmakers could do is let kids join social networks at age 16 and have actual resources for kids who need them, for vulnerable kids, for LGBTQ kids, for all kids who need mental health services. In their physical communities, which is where they should be, because LGBTQIA plus kids are facing unthinkable abuse online, right? So it's not this happy place where they solve their problems. I don't know if you want to say more about that, but it's both.
It's both. I think you and I share a sense of optimism about the internet. You can't do your job or mine day after day and not find kernels of hope in those places. And I don't know that I agree with quite such an older age when I think about those vulnerable groups. But if you can build the utopia where they're getting what they need on a local level, great, yeah.
Let's do it.
All right. You all in? I think we have time for one more question, though that was such a delightful, upbeat note that maybe we just say, here's to Kara's Utopia. Kara, thank you so much. This was a wonderful conversation.
Thank you all. Thank you so much, Madison.
Anytime.